Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colin Foreman and I'm the editor of MEED. And welcome to this webinar on the GCC rail and metro projects market. First, a little brief introduction as to what MEED is. MEED has a number of business information platforms. There's meed.com, which you can see on the screen on the left, which is a monthly magazine, a website. And on the right, we have MEED Projects, MEED, which is a data project tracking service. MEED is a journalism format, so it's news stories and feature articles, whereas MEED Projects is a tracking service which provides information on projects, their status, and key contact people on different projects. A couple of promotional items which I'd just like to make you aware of. We have a new MENA Rail and Metro's 2025 report. Normally this costs $4,000, but if you use the webinar 600 code, you can get a further $600 discount. This provides a review of projects across the MENA region. This webinar today is looking at the GCC specifically, whereas this report is looking at the whole MENA region. So that includes the rest of the Middle East and North Africa. And another important event which MEED is hosting on the 20th of November, we have our MENA Construction Summit, where there'll be a wide range of speakers talking about projects across the region, including the key markets for construction, which is the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. So there'll be speakers talking about the main schemes and the drivers for what's happening in those construction markets over the next few years. We've had the event before in Dubai, and it's always been a great forum to engage in discussion and find out more about what's going on projects across the region. So with that, I'll move on to my overview of the GCC or road projects market. In this, I'll detail a few bits on specific projects, but I'll start off with an overview, and I'll maybe just introduce some of the trends, and then we'll get into a few of the specifics of projects which have been changing or there's been details emerging over the last month or two, and then we'll open up into some Q&A towards the end. So if you do see anything that you'd like to comment or ask a question on, then I'll get round to that towards the end of the session. So just to start off at the beginning for the GCC and railways, there has been a railway in the GCC a long time ago, which first opened in 1908, but this was really a bit of a false start in terms of what we're talking about today. This is a project that was built during the Ottoman era, and the aim was for it to reach Mecca, but it only got as far as Medina, and then it really fell into disrepair and out of use. But it was an interesting first project to be delivered in the region in terms of rails concerned, and on the slide there you can see a picture of it from the 1920s. So while we're talking about a lot of projects that are new, there is a bit of a track record and quite a long history in some ways of rail in the region. Where do we stand today? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. Saudi Arabia, the largest country in the region in terms of geographical area and population, not surprisingly, has the largest or the most amount of railway. Various projects there have been completed, and some very big schemes that have been delivered over the last 10 to 15 years. In second place, the second largest country by population is the UAE, and there's Etihad Rail there and Dubai Metro, which have been completed. Joining the club more recently in terms of having operational rail is Qatar with Doha Metro, and the other three states that there isn't really anything that you could call an operational railway or metro in those countries. So bit of a mix in terms of the pace of development and what's been delivered in terms of rail across the region. But as we'll find out soon, there's a lot of plans to get rail really up and running across the GCC now. We have a little look here at the sort of historical performance of the rail market in terms of construction or project awards. It's really been quite a series of peaks and troughs. If we start at the left and look at 2005, that was really when there was things like Dubai Metro and other projects in Saudi Arabia were starting to be awarded. There was then a dip, and a few more jobs were then awarded in 2009, 2011, again in Saudi Arabia. And then 2013, there was really the great peak of rail when the three main contracting consortiums won work on Riyadh Metro, which I remember correctly was about $23 billion of contracts awarded effectively in one day. At the same time, there was also contracts around that time being awarded on Doha Metro. So it really was quite a strong period for the rail industry in the region. And I can remember conferences at the time, there was a lot of excitement throughout the supply chain, really, of this pipeline of rail projects that would be coming through. So at the time, the feeling was that Riyadh Metro would then lead into Jeddah Metro. Riyadh would lead into Mecca Metro. Then there was Jeddah Metro and some other metro schemes planned in Saudi Arabia. You had Dubai was starting to talk about the Expo 2020 link. That still went ahead, but some of those other schemes in Saudi Arabia that didn't proceed. There was also a lot of talk at the time about Oman's rail network proceeding, and also things like the link between Qatar and Saudi Arabia starting to move forward. That already kept going for a few years, and then by 2016 it really ran out of steam as a lot of these projects began to be really put on hold by governments as they look at their budgets with the drop in oil prices that began in 2014. A lot of rail projects really stalled. We then saw a pickup again in 2019 after a couple of years of, I suppose you could almost call it drought for the rail industry. And really that was the restart of Etihad Rail, which began before COVID with the award of some major contracts for the second phase of Etihad Rail. And that's really when the rail market began to show signs of resurgence again. And then if we look at in 2023 and 2024, we've had a pickup in awards again. But for me, the sort of the restart of the rail projects market began back in 2019 when Etihad Rail began to restart that phase 2 tendering process. So as I've just said there's been peaks and troughs for the projects market as far as rail's concerned. Those of you that were around in 2015-16 might be feeling that we've been there before with a lot of enthusiasm and exuberance about rail projects. Do you think it's going to maintain momentum this time, or do we think oil prices might dip or geopolitical uncertainty might, pardon the pun, derail some of those ambitions? I'd be very interested to know what you think. Do you think it's going to maintain momentum, or do you think it might stall again? I'll just give it a little bit more time for the votes to come in. Okay, I'll leave it there, although you can keep voting. It looks like 75% of people think, yes, it will maintain momentum, whereas 25% don't. So that's quite a nice split there, nice even numbers. I think, yes, I think there's a very big difference in terms of what's happening today with rail than what's happened in the past. And it's probably good that we can explore that on the next couple of slides. Before we get to some of the drivers of what's going on, I think it's just important just to look at the where the rail contracts have been awarded over the last 20 years. And this really just reflects what I said earlier when I said that Saudi Arabia's got the most operational railway, followed by the UAE and Qatar. So if we look at the value of contract awards, we can see Saudi Arabia is more than double that of the UAE. And then Qatar's following behind with Doha Metro. And then more recently, there's been awards in Oman with the Hafid Rail project. And then on the right-hand side, we can just see that as a pie chart, really just showing the dominance of Saudi Arabia. Right, going back to the poll question where you answered yes. I mean, obviously, we don't know whether that's the right answer, or 75% of you voted yes. Obviously, we don't know whether that's right or wrong. We need to see what happens in the future. But for my money, one of the key differences of what's happening today than compared to what happened in, let's say, the 2014 sort of era when there was a lot of things happening, is today there seems to be a lot more political buy-in to the rail projects across the region. Back in 2014, You heard from client bodies when they were pitching to governments to get projects moving. It was really based on the business case, and projects really had to show that they were going to make money. It was really regarded as an investment by governments that really needed to sort of generate a very solid financial return really in quite a short time frame, which made it quite difficult for client bodies to demonstrate a business case for a new transport system with little track record in the region. So it was quite difficult to get some of those things over the line when it comes to things like budget approval. And I think that was a little bit of a frustration that people in the industry felt at the time, that there's projects that they felt made a good idea in the long term, but there just wasn't quite the buy-in at the highest level in terms of getting them to move ahead. That all really changed in 2021 with the Al Ula agreement. Although the Al Ula agreement was really focused on the end of the diplomatic dispute with Qatar and other people in the region, there was a commitment in there from the leaders of the GCC to really start exploring the Gulf Railway network again. There was a few other things in that agreement which really looked to stitch the 6 GCC states closer together again across a number of fields. So things like, cultural, society and things, but also economically. And railway was earmarked as something that would make a key difference to tying the economies of the region together. And really since then, the pace at which rail projects have moved forward has really shifted. Just within a few months of the Al Ula agreement, you started to see ministerial meetings between ministers of transport with different GCC states beginning to explore projects to establish rail links between different countries. So you had ministers from Saudi Arabia meeting with ministers from Qatar, likewise with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. So there's really been a lot of activity coming from the top down. So I guess really in simple terms, I think the push for rail in previous eras has been really from the bottom up. There's been client bodies looking at delivering rail projects, trying to push them up for approval, whereas this time around it feels that there's people at the top pushing the rail projects through. So from my reading of that, I think that means that the likelihood of things going ahead at the moment is much greater than it would have been in the past. So I'd be inclined to agree that the momentum this time will be maintained and a lot less susceptible to the economic peaks and troughs that we've experienced in previous eras. Just to get a feel of how quickly things are picking up, this table really shows quite an interesting fact here. So really, if you look at all the big contract awards that we've had over the last 20 years, the majority of them are really quite historical at the moment. So there's things like the Haramain high-speed network, Riyadh Metro, which I've mentioned, Doha Metro, even the Dubai Metro original lines that were awarded in 2005. And the Expo extension that was awarded in 2016. And there hasn't been that much in the way of major new contracts signed yet. I think that's really just reflective of how long these things take to come through into contract award. There's obviously quite a bit of time taken between a decision made by a government or a policy maker, between that coming through the design process and coming out as a major contract award. So at the moment, I don't think we've really had the pickup in activity in terms of construction contract awards that we've probably been hoping for, although I believe that is coming. There's a couple of exceptions on there, which is the NEOM running tunnels, which are under construction at the moment. For those of you that don't know, there's a railway infrastructure backbone running along what's called the spine of the 170-kilometer line at NEOM. So that's a massive undertaking of a rail project that really will be serving the basis of a whole new city, which is being built on a sort of a linear form. So that's one of the new projects which is starting to come through, and that's obviously fairly early work with tunneling works going through. So there's a lot of that sort of contract now, which we would expect to feed through into the future. So just one other thing which I think is important just to highlight in terms of trends and why I think rail Rail is an exciting industry anyway, and important for the region, and it attracts a lot of interest, no matter where you are in the world. But I think one thing that's particularly interesting about rail, from a construction and project point of view, is the type of companies that it brings in. If we look now at a lot of the real estate development and other construction work that's going on, and to a certain degree, a lot of the infrastructure work that's being delivered across the region now, it's very much a local business, as domestic capacity has been built up. That most construction projects now can be delivered by local companies who've spent the last 20 years delivering major projects. Rail really is still one of those few things that requires international expertise. So obviously there's the rolling stock provider that normally forms a part of the consortium, and there's none of them are based locally. So that's people from Europe or the Far East, typically, which are the consortium member for the rolling stock. And also the same applies to the systems. But then joining them, there's normally heavyweight contracting companies to deliver the civil work, and they normally partner with local contractors. So if we look at that list there, you can really get a good feel for that. So if we just take, for example, the Red Line extension for Dubai Metro, you've got Alstom, a European rolling stock provider, and then with Gullamak and Acciona, so that's two international contractors there. And if you see on all of the lists, you'll see a similar makeup. So you get that international feel. And I think really there's several things that appeal to the international firms there. One, really for the capability and the technical expertise that the international contractor brings. But then on top of that, there's also the scale and the differentiation that they can offer, and also the local market. But despite there being some major rail projects delivered over the last 15 to 20 years, still hasn't built up that strong domestic capability that maybe some of the international players have had who've been working on rail projects for a bit longer. So it's interesting to just see the makeup, because that's something that we don't see too much anymore, just as the sort of the local capacity, or more importantly, the local capability in contracting as it has developed over the last 20 years. Again, if we look there, that list really just shows again how you get a mix of international and local companies that have been delivering road projects. These are companies that have worked on things historically, so you can see there's a few names there that probably won't be participating in things in the future due to various issues. But as we can see, it's a mix of international and local companies that are really taking part in these projects. This shows you who's active and under construction at the moment. This is quite an important chart because it just gives you a feel of who's got the capacity at the moment. And then assuming that the projects are delivered and go quite well, it gives you an idea of who might have appetite for future work in the region. So again, we can see there's a mix there of local and international contractors. I think possibly we're seeing a little bit of a lean more now towards Asian companies. At the top of the list there, you see Larsen and Toubro, who've developed quite a lot of capability at delivering rail projects in recent years. And then the other group of contractors which are really quite active now are the Chinese contractors. So I think Asia is becoming more dominant than, say, maybe they had been in the past. So again, interesting. And also on all these jobs, they're normally joined by a large number of local contractors in the supply chain who are operating as subcontractors. Obviously, these are major projects with a large number of trades and services being fed into them. There's a lot of work going on in the region, but at the same time, it's still really not that much when you compare it to what's planned. As I said before, there's a lot of railway projects planned now. These are really being pushed quite hard by the government. And from a government point of view, there's several dimensions to this. So there's as I mentioned, there's the sort of ALULA impact, that sort of regional integration, which is sort of regional rail projects that are looking to stitch economies together, make the region benefit from economies of scale, turning it into a block of countries that can trade a lot more effectively. There's also the sort of geopolitical strategic element to it. So if you look at some of the UAE, for example, The UAE's rail connection with Oman manages to put quite a lot of its freight potentially outside the Strait of Hormuz, which is a strategic concern for the UAE, and has been a strategic concern for a number of years. So that's one dimension. There's also the putting cities close to one another. You know, some of these high-speed rail links that are talked about between, say, Riyadh and Doha or Riyadh and Kuwait, really makes cities a lot more closer together and fosters greater ties. Then on the other side, if we look away from the regional rail story, there's a lot of metro projects which are planned, certainly for people living in Dubai at the moment, and it's definitely the same in cities such as Riyadh. Traffic is a bugbear. There's a lot of economic activity. A lot of people go to work every day or doing school runs, and traffic's becoming a politically sensitive issue. I think if you look at some of the statements that are coming out of transport authorities now, they're really trying to show that they're on top of the traffic problem in various cities across the region. And I think metros are seen as a way of offering people an alternative to using motor cars and try to take some of that traffic off the road. So there's a lot of emphasis there from a sort of urban development point of view that metros are needed to try and take some of that pressure away from the road system. So if we just look at the numbers, there's about 98 billion of work that's not awarded, and quite a lot of that's still in the study and design phase, and there's a little bit at the bid and contract PQ and bid evaluation. So that suggests that there's quite a long burning pipeline there for rail projects in the coming years. If we then look at which countries have got the most work that's yet to be awarded, again, it's Saudi Arabia, which is offering the most in terms of volume of work. Qatar also has a lot, followed by the UAE. It's perhaps interesting that the UAE is not ahead of Qatar there. I think that the possible explanation for that is that the UAE's already delivered quite a lot of rail projects. But I also know of some other schemes that are planned in the UAE which are yet to really move beyond that sort of very early conceptual stage. So that UAE number could creep up even further in the future. And then we have Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman there, which are the three smaller markets in the region in terms of rail. But interestingly, all three of them do have rail projects that they want to proceed with. So while they might be smaller markets, they still have the ambitions to have urban rail networks, so that, as I discussed, to try and help with things like traffic, and also connect themselves up to the rest of the GCC and benefit from those economies of scale of being a larger economic bloc. So that's really the sort of the backdrop and overview for the region. As I said, there's projects planned in each country. I'll now just pick out a couple of ones which seem to be the most topical ones at the moment, and then do a quick summary, and then we can move into some questions and answers. So in the UAE, there's quite a lot of activity at the moment. There's and it's really across a number of fronts. So if we look at Dubai first, there's an extension or a new line being or going to be built for Dubai Metro, which is known as the Blue Line. This has been around for a while as a project which has previously been known as extensions to the Red and Green Line. There was then a decision to combine it as one line and rename it as the Blue Line. So this is a project which is now at the tendering phase and closes in October. From our information, there seems to be 4 groups that are prospective bidders, and again we've got that mix of international with local contractors that are bidding there. So if you can see, there's Far Eastern players with local contractors. There's again Chinese companies, Europeans, and Chinese and regional players again. So that's the sort of the mix of companies that you would expect to see for a major rail tender. So that's being submitted in October. These things typically take quite a few months to be awarded. So I think, given that the prices go in October, I think there might be an ambition to maybe get it awarded before the end of the year, but my feeling is it will probably be early 2025 before you see a contract award on that one. But that's a major project for Dubai, and I think really the first major public works project to move ahead since really pre-Expo and pre-COVID. I mean, Dubai's done a lot of work in terms of real estate development and building work over the last 3 years, but public works has lagged behind a little bit. And I think this is really the first big public works project which Dubai is pushing through. So very interesting one to watch to see A, when that gets awarded, and B, to see which team wins. There's a little bit of history there on Dubai Metro, obviously, with them delivering 2 projects previously. Mitsubishi led a consortium that delivered the first one, and then Alstom did. So it'll be interesting to see which team wins out. So yeah, a lot to watch there for the beginning of next year. There's also activity then, if we shift away from Dubai as a city, there's the federal network, which is Etihad Rail. So there's parts of that for phase 2, which are now complete. And then there's additional work being done to that network to offer passenger services. I'll just stress that this is conventional speed passenger services. So that includes, in addition, it runs on mostly on the same lines as the freight network, but that means that there'll need to be stations and a few spur lines constructed, which are at the construction phase at the moment. There's quite active construction sites across the UAE now, particularly in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and also in Sharjah now, for building passenger stations for the Etihad rail network. So that's a development that's really gathering pace now. There was announcements on the passenger trains being ordered. So it started the day when the UAE is offering passenger services is getting closer. Then it's not going to be too long now before we'll have the option to travel around the UAE by train, which will be interesting to see the take up on that and whether it takes cars off the road, say, but on the larger commutes, say things like the Dubai to Abu Dhabi commute, which at times can be very busy. In addition to conventional speed, which is already at the construction stage, there's plans for high-speed lines, which will connect Abu Dhabi with Dubai, Abu Dhabi with Al Ain, and then at a later stage also to Sharjah. This project there hasn't been too much in the way of official announcements on this one, but it is starting to move forward. There's soil investigation work which has been done in various areas of Dubai, so that we know that that's being planned. There's also been an invitation for companies to pre-qualify for work on that scheme, and not surprisingly, it's the same sort of international and local contractor mix that's very interested in participating in that project, and a high degree of technical abilities needed to deliver a high-speed rail project. So that's getting a lot of international interest, and those companies are really forming consortiums at the moment. So that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar project spend, which will attract a lot of attention. And then if we just look at Abu Dhabi on its own, they formed Abu Dhabi Transport Company, and there's now talk about restarting some plans that Abu Dhabi's had for quite some time, which include a metro and a light rail. So there's quite a bit of talk now on rail services within Abu Dhabi being developed. There's also a phase of the high-speed rail project which will offer a link within Abu Dhabi as well. So while Dubai at the moment is the only emirate with an urban rail network, Abu Dhabi has plans to join them fairly soon as they start moving ahead with projects there. Staying with the UAE, but also linking into Oman, is the Oman rail link. This is a project which again has been talked about for probably about 10 years. It was put on hold, I think, around 2016 when it was part of, or the link up to the border was part of Etihad Rail. It then got reinvigorated a couple of years ago with the formation of the Oman Etihad Rail Company, which has now been renamed as Hafid Rail. And they then tendered contracts. So this is a rail link which will connect UAE through into Oman. And in April, they awarded 3 civil works packages, which was a major step forward. And those contractors are now starting to mobilise. We can see there an image that they released showing that site visits were ongoing with client bodies and contractors. It's estimated to be worth about 1.5 billion, design and build, and it has an interesting team working on it. There's Abu Dhabi company, so that's National Projects Construction, which is part of Alpha Dhabi, and then National Infrastructure Construction Company, which is an organization which is created to help deliver infrastructure projects, specifically rail, in the UAE. TriStar, another UAE contractor, and then partnering up with one of Oman's largest construction companies, Galfar Engineering and Contracting. So a UAE Oman mix there to that consortium. There was also to the side of that, there was a rolling stock and integrations contract, which was awarded to Germany's Siemens with Egyptian contractor Hassan Alam. So that shows you again that sort of international local mix there. If we go to the next slide, we can see more details of what that project actually entails. So you can see the packages there. You can see there's the line there that's going from Wathbuf on the left-hand side in Abu Dhabi or the UAE, which then continues up towards the UAE-Oman border. And then there's the orange line that continues on to Sohar, and then some other spur lines as well. So really quite a wide project area to cover, and some difficult engineering. Anyone that's driven through those areas before, you can see from the shading on the map, it's quite mountainous. Once you get over the border to try and get to Sohar, there are valleys and things to get through, but it's not the simplest geography to get through. So it's quite a challenging project to be delivered. But the client body, Etihad Rail, has experience of working in similar sorts of areas in other parts of the network that they've already delivered. As I said, there's a high-speed rail that's talked about. I mentioned that contractors are pre-qualifying. This is just a little bit more detail on what that project entails. Unlike the conventional, the speed, the operating or the design speed is much higher, and the operating speed is expected to be about 320 kilometers an hour. It's split into different phases. So the first phase is connecting Abu Dhabi with Dubai, which is probably the greatest volume of traffic, given that they're the 2 largest cities in the UAE. Then the second phase, as I mentioned, is a connection within Abu Dhabi city. So that's an inner city rail network. And then phase 3 is a rail connection between Abu Dhabi and Al Ain. Quite a large number of Abu Dhabi nationals live in Al Ain, and I think this will really help the people living in Al Ain, working in obviously the main economic centre of Abu Dhabi, with that sort of daily commute. So I think that's quite an important project for the future. And then the fourth phase, which has been an interesting one, is the inter-emirate connection between Dubai and Sharjah. The transport links between Dubai and Sharjah have traditionally often been viewed as not being as good as they should be, and this looks to be addressing one of those major bugbears, certainly for people that commute between Sharjah and Dubai every day. The first phase, just to give a little bit more detail on, the first phase is split into different packages. So phase 1A is from the Zakia to Yas Island. Phase 1B, Yas Island to the Abu Dhabi-Dubai border. Then phase 1C is from the border into Jeddah, which is close to the creek, for those of you that know it. And then there's also a junction at Abu Dhabi Airport and a station at Abu Dhabi Airport. Interestingly as well, there's quite a lot of tunnelling works. If we look at some of the other rail projects in the region, they've tended to look at being at grade. This one, obviously 31 is not the majority of the line, but there's a significant amount of tunnelling there, which is more expensive and heavier civil work. So that's quite a significant undertaking. And as you can see there, there's some detail of some of the stations that are being done. Some are at grade, or elevated, whereas others will be underground. We now move away from the UAE and look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of activity happening across the project spectrum, and rail is no exception. There's really quite a broad range of work that's coming up in Saudi Arabia at various different stages. So I'll try to capture some of it. I couldn't really capture all of it in one slide, but I'll just point out a couple of highlights. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of tendering activity for the rail work or the rail corridor work at NEOM. So as I mentioned earlier, there's the line, so there's those tunnel contracts, but there's also the large interconnector, which is connecting the railway that runs along the line to the port. And the port is known as Oxagon. So there's basically a line, a railway line that comes off the line down towards the port. So there's a lot of contract activity happening at developing the infrastructure there. Moving away from NEOM, although NEOM could possibly be a presentation all on its own, it's such a large project and development. Al Ula, which is the sort of the heritage focused development in Saudi Arabia. There's a tram. Alstom have been appointed as the rolling stock provider, and there's tendering now for civil works there. So that's another project that's moving ahead in a real live tender. Then perhaps some of you will be more familiar with this, given that Riyadh Metro is a project that's been around for a while. The lines at Riyadh Metro, the existing lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 have been or are being handed over, and there's been statements from the Transport Ministry saying that it's expected to be open this year. I've heard rumours of several dates for when that date's going to be, or on what date it will open, and it does feel that although there's been announcements that an opening date is imminent, it does feel that the project is going to open very, very shortly. So that's a major step forward for Riyadh Metro. But then at the same time, there's tendering that's already started for expansions to what they're going to be opening most likely this year. So at the moment, there's a tender that's been going on for an extension to line 2, and that one was tendered really just to the 3 existing consortiums that are working. The contracts that were awarded for lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in 2013 were won by 3 different consortiums, and that's the FAS consortium, the BAX consortium, and the Ariad New Mobility. Those consortiums, the makeup has changed a little bit. Obviously, there's a lot happened over the last 11 years globally and in Riyadh. And those consortiums aren't exactly the same as what they were when they were first formed in 2013. But those are the 3 teams that are competing for line 2, and an award is expected very, very shortly. On top of that, as a separate tender, there's a tender for line 7, which has now been issued. And that's got a slightly different group of contractors that are looking at it. So the information we have, there's a team which has Alstom, FCC, Freyssinet, WeBuild, and Nesma. There's another team that has Siemens, Samsung, Acciona, and Alayuni. Then another team which is Hitachi Rail, Ochla, Daewoo, Hyundai, Al-Mabani, and Al-Bawani. And then there's a 4th team, which is CRRC, MAPA, and LEMAX. So again, as I've keep saying, a mix of international and local contracting consortiums looking at line 7 and competing on that. So really, in the next 6 months, we could well be seeing 2 major contract awards for work on Riyadh Metro being made. Another major project which I've been writing about for the best part of 2 decades in Saudi Arabia is the land bridge. This is the project which will effectively connect the west and east coasts of Saudi Arabia by rail. There's already a rail link between the east coast and Riyadh. So the focus of the work is mostly on connecting the Red Sea coast to Riyadh, and then work around Riyadh before going east towards the east coast. There's been some movement on that. They did form a consortium to do it on a PPP basis in 2018. which is formed by Saudi Arabian Railways and China Civil Engineering Construction Company. Those two groups are really still in talks to try and get this project moving. There's an understanding that that's going to be happening very, very soon. And at the end of last year, as another step forward, there was a project management team appointed to manage the construction of the project. So that project looks like, after a number of years in the planning phase, that's going to move into construction again as well. And that's another massive civil engineering project which has to negotiate all sorts of terrain, you know, including desert, which has issues with things like sand mitigation, and passing through mountains, which obviously has issues with gradient, and you know, requires an awful lot of earth moving and blasting and things like that. So major projects that are coming up in Saudi Arabia. And I then try and just whisk through the rest of the GCC before I move on to questions and answers. There's a rail link between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, which is planned for this second causeway, which is going to be built between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. There's also been, again, another project which we talked about 15 years ago, the Qatar-Bahrain Causeway. There have been some talks between officials in Doha and Manama about that project, and that would include a rail link as well. So that's another development on that one. Bahrain has announced plans for a metro as well, which would be done as a PPP. Consortiums had pre-qualified for the scheme last year, and although a tender hasn't been issued yet, so still waiting on details for what would happen there. And then there's high-speed rail links planned between Doha and Riyadh. They're at this sort of the design and study phase at the moment. And Doha's planned sort of regional rail networks before. There's also extensions to Doha Metro, which are planned. And then for Kuwait, there's been some talk of the Kuwait Metro project being restarted, and then also that links with Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So there's quite a lot there. And one other one which I neglected to put on, which I can just add just in with talking, is there's plans for a metro system in Muscat as well. So that's another major project which could be upcoming in the next few years. So really an awful lot of work to talk about there with rail. And I think the interesting thing before we move on to question and answers is just how, if these projects move ahead the way they're expected to, it's really going to build a strong GCC focused rail industry that's going to build up capability very quickly. There's going to be people living and working in the region that are experts on rail and have delivered projects. And if there's a pipeline of projects for them to work on, I expect that will gain more and more critical mass, which should make delivering projects easier as they just incrementally add to existing networks. So if all goes well, it's really very positive for the rail industry in the region. Just there, that's a marketing slide if any of you are interested in any of the products that we have. Again, there's MEED.com, MEED projects, but we also have research reports, events, and marketing solutions. And again, just to reiterate, if you're interested in rail, there's the MENA Rail and Metro Projects 2025 report. And there's a discount code there for you to use if you'd like to get that for a discounted price, which has a lot of the sort of the granular detail about projects that are coming up, and also a lot of graphics and map information for you to really understand what these projects are all about. And again, there's the MENA Construction Summit. So we now move on to Q&A. Just need to see where the questions are. Apologies, I have some issues seeing the questions coming through on the Q&A. Okay, I've got the questions. Apologies for that. Okay, the first question is a technical one. I will apologize straight away. I'm not a technical person. If I could elaborate on sand and Sabca hazards encompassing the GCC rail projects. I haven't worked on that in detail, so I couldn't give you any technical information, but I do know there have been studies before, certainly for Etihad Rail, and I think on the land bridge as well, to try and understand the sort of the impact of dune sand on rail projects. So that's something which is a known issue, and there have been studies that have been done on that before. But I don't have much in the way of technical detail, but I know it has been flagged as an issue before, and they have done studies on it. I don't know what the exact recommendations of those studies were. Next question, how do you view various EPC contractors' right to win? Well, comment on L&T's win rates. I think it's a little bit unfair just to pick on one contractor, but L&T has won work in Riyadh before and also in Doha, if I remember correctly. I think that speaking from a macro point of view, L&T's picked up a lot of experience in the region, but also in its home market in India, delivering a lot of rail projects. And they've obviously built up capability and scale at doing that. So I think they're a force to be reckoned with when it comes to delivering rail work. I think it also would be quite interesting just to see who they partner with, in terms of, certainly if you're looking at things like high speed, whether they can bring a partner or join forces with someone that has that sort of high speed capability. And just in general, like I said earlier, I think my trend, I would say, is that I think the market is looking more Eastern focused than Western focused in terms of the contractors that are working on rail projects in the region. It feels that there's a bit more of an Asian look in terms of the contracting makeup for a lot of the big work. Where I think that's slightly different is that the European rolling stock providers, so that would be Alstom and Siemens, still hold quite a strong position. But I think from the contracting, the civil work, I think it's a lot more Eastern focused than maybe it has been in the past. There's another question here on Bahrain Metro. I'm hearing mixed noises on Bahrain Metro. I'm flying to Bahrain tomorrow, so I'm hoping to get a lot more solid info on what's happening with Bahrain Metro, but I'm hearing mixed things about what's happening with Bahrain Metro. Obviously, there's been a period of time since they made announcements about the pre-qualified consortiums and launching the project. And as you would expect, if there's a period of time, the market speculates as to what's going on. So at the moment, it's not really sure. Saudi land bridge, my understanding is that there'll be work moving on site very, very shortly. There's a question there saying, is there nothing on the land bridge? My understanding is that's about to start very, very soon. Etihad Rail was packaged up, so that there weren't. The question is, why is Etihad Rail not in the top list? Etihad Rail was packaged up into smaller packages, which meant it didn't end up getting into the higher list. So yes, there was a lot of work in, if you combine it all together, for Etihad Rail, but on their own, the packages weren't quite so large. There's a question here on, is NEOM still proceeding? Yes, I think NEOM is still proceeding. I think what's happened over the last year and a half is that the development of NEOM has had to focus on getting things, what are the sort of the priority projects or priority phases of the project. So whereas in the past there was this feeling that, you know, the whole thing would be delivered in one go, I think there's now a focus on the buildings around the hidden marina, and the infrastructure serving that. So I think, yes, NEOM is still proceeding, but it's refocused some of its efforts on delivering the first key components of the project. if that's what you're talking about with the line, NEOM's obviously a much bigger thing than just the line. So there's other elements such as Trojena and Oxagon as well. Opportunities in the UAE, we can speak more about that. I think I covered most of the things there. I think it just very simply, I would put it into several buckets. I would say there's the Dubai Metro opportunity with the blue line, which is a live opportunity, which is hopefully moving into construction next year. There's the Etihad rail work, which is ongoing. There's then the high-speed rail with various phases. And I think the interesting things there are obviously the high-speed connections between the major cities of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but also the sort of the inner city network in Abu Dhabi and the connection to Sharjah. The promoter of the UAE-Oman rail link, there's a question of who's promoting that. In very simple terms, it's a joint venture of the UAE and Oman. There was an entity from each country formed a joint venture delivery vehicle to deliver it, which then rebranded itself as Hafi Rail. Yes, I covered the Qatar market. There's a question there saying, I heard the land bridge is being shelved. Frankly, I've been reporting on the land bridge since 2005, I think. So I've heard land bridges on, land bridges off, lots and lots of times. The last information I heard was that it's starting construction very shortly. However, I've been there before and seen it quite a lot of times, so I wouldn't be surprised if that doesn't happen. But my information is that it's about to start pretty soon. Detailed question here. Do I think there will be a shift from EPC state operations to a different ownership operator model, PPP, especially for lighter PAX infrastructure facilities as demand? I think one of it's a question asking about PPP. I think one of the challenges with PPP is if it's for passenger services, it's very difficult for some places to know what the ridership will be. And then, how would an operator get their money back if you're not sure what the ridership is like? I think that's been one of the challenges, not just in the Middle East, but globally for rail. And it's also a massive infrastructure investment required to get a rail scheme going, certainly when you're talking about things like metro. So I think that would be difficult. There's possibly a conversation there to be had, and you do mention that in your question, with sort of a lighter type of infrastructure. So maybe something like a tram or some kind of BRT might work better as a PPP, which doesn't require quite the same level of infrastructure investment. So I think if I was going to expect to see anything, I think it would be on a smaller rather than a larger scale. My feeling is that the investment required in the infrastructure and the uncertainty of how a heavy or how a metro would perform in a market that hasn't had a rail network before means they're just a little bit difficult to get over the line. But I think for some of those smaller things, say a small tram system encased within a certain development, that could potentially be easier to get going. Another question on land bridge. There seems to be a lot of interest. I heard in the next few months, but like I said, I'm not 100% sure whether that will actually happen. Let's see what happens. I've been hearing similar things for a long, long time. There's another question there about Jordan. I think the important thing, I mean, this is a presentation on the GCC, but I think it's a good to raise the question about Jordan and connections beyond the GCC. Obviously, there's a GCC railway which is being built. The sort of conceptual difficulty with that is that the GCC railway will be based in the GCC and will only connect 6 countries. There's the potential there to have that extend further north and connect up to other markets. And then ultimately, I guess the ambition would be to connect into a broader Asian and European network. So there's been quite a lot of talk recently about rail links in Iraq, and then also up to Jordan, the Levant, and then ideally up into Turkey. And once you're up into Turkey, you can then start thinking about getting a rail link up into Europe. So there's a lot of grand plans in terms of where rail could sort of, you could have this sort of international rail network that the GCC is part of, and then also connecting up to the Mediterranean. So that would offer an opportunity to not go through the Suez Canal, for example. So there's lots of, I guess I would really put them in the sort of the geopolitical conversation at the moment, where there's people talking about what sort of rail options there could be, or rail corridors there could be, to solve various strategic challenges that are faced by certain countries. But certainly the opportunity for the GCC to have a rail connection up into Europe, a rail connection onto the Mediterranean, avoiding the Suez Canal. There's lots of nice things that the GCC could get there. The difficulty is that they have to get through some tricky territory in terms of geopolitics in Iraq and other places. So some interesting conversations there. And then, as you asked there about Jordan, the Jordan one would go from Saudi Arabia. I have seen some alignments that do potentially take rail from sort of northern Saudi Arabia up right across Jordan and then up towards the Mediterranean coast. So again, I think geopolitically that's very attractive and has a lot of plus points. It's whether they can be, if they can get through some of those geopolitical difficulties, and then there's all the usual, will it be tendered, what are the tender prices, all that kind of stuff that would then follow. Forecast, do we have any forecast on rail consumption? We've got forecast there, which I shared on terms of contract awards. Rail consumption, if you're talking about end users, I haven't seen too much forecast on, say, the sort of the passenger demand, or then on supply chain. We don't have granular detail on products and items that will be supplied into rail. There's a question about Muscat Metro. Yes, that's in the planning stages now. So that's a project which is coming through. Another question on Jeddah Metro. Jeddah Metro, there has been some talk of it. I haven't seen too much. The one that seems to be more advanced than Jeddah is Mecca, where they've re-engaged consultants. So I think there are further metro projects planned in Saudi Arabia, which again takes us back to that pipeline of projects with different metros across different cities in Saudi Arabia. There's a question there on the connector. The question saying, I've heard the connector, for those of you that don't know, is the connection between the line and the oxygen line. There's a question there saying the connector has been stopped. I think there's perhaps a slightly different way to answer that question. I think there's been difficulties with that project starting. I'm not quite sure on the exact reasons why, but I know there have been challenges getting that job moving. There's a question there asking about a rail connecting Saudi and Jordan. Yes, as I said, I've seen an alignment that's suggesting that. There's a question about any impact of current Gulf security issue affecting current projects. I think security is an issue which all projects face. There's two ways to look at this one. There's one, is a security issue going to stop projects from going ahead? That's always a possibility for any project, really. But I think one of the things that the Gulf has learned over the last few years is that it's stronger if they work together. And I think going back to that Al-Ula agreement, I think really that's the sort of overriding attitude which came through from that agreement. So I think while security is an issue, I think rail in some ways helps overcome some of those security issues that you might have in terms of providing a a strong infrastructure backbone within the GCC, which could potentially mean you're insulated from some of the security issues that you might have. I mean, just to pick one as an example, we've seen issues with piracy and things in the Red Sea, which can affect the movement of goods, certainly to the parts of Saudi Arabia and then up to the Suez Canal. If you've got rail as another option, that shields you from some of those security issues. So I can look at the security thing from two ways. Yes, it could negatively impact, but then at the same time, security concerns can actually promote projects a little bit more. So there's two ways, there's two sides to that coin. Yes, Kuwait and Saudi high-speed link. The latest info we had on that is that the government had basically approved the initial studies, so it's now going to move to the next stage at looking on how to move that forward. So I think the idea on that is starting to move forward, but it's at early stages. Jeddah Metro, as I mentioned, there is some talk of Jeddah Metro coming back, and Mecca Metro consultants are engaged again. So Mecca Metro seems to be moving forward. I think the question for Mecca Metro is, if you remember in 2014, I think it was, there was a consortium that was in line to pick up some work at Mecca Metro. I think that consortium won't really be the same now, given that a couple of the members of the consortium aren't really the same sort of company as they were back then. So I think there'll be some change in how that moves forward. But yes, that's back on the agenda. I'll take one or two last questions. There's one question asking why Japanese civil contractors are not heavily piling into GCC projects. They are active in Asia Pacific. I thought the Middle East would be on their radar too. It's my feeling, and I can't speak on their behalf, but my feeling is that they've had bad experiences on projects in the region and that therefore are not keen to be involved again. I think that on quite a few projects, not just on rail, Japanese contractors have been hit with losses, and I think they feel that the market for civil construction is not for them. That's my personal take. I might not be correct on that. Let me just pick one last question. Yeah, the last one is, can you confirm the procuring authority for the UAE high-speed rail? Yes, that is that's Etihad Rail. The question there asked if it was the RTA. No, the RTA is purely based in Dubai. So that would be Etihad Rail for that one. I think there's quite a lot of other questions that have been coming through. So if you do have anything specific and you would like to ask me directly, my email is on the screen there. If you'd like to drop me an email, I'll do my best to answer the question with the best of information that we have. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I've enjoyed sharing the information we have, and I've also enjoyed your questions, and I apologize I've not been able to get to everybody's question. But it's always interesting to hear what you in the market are feeling and what you need more information on, and some interesting points there about different schemes and the status of them. So thank you very much for your questions. And again, if you do have anything that you'd like to ask me directly, please feel free to reach out by email. And thank you very much for attending. Thank you.